Okay.
Go ahead. You can go ahead and introduce the
Okay,
session. I
thanks.
have these.
Sorry about the technical difficulty. My name is Tanya Murky-Epp, Project Manager with the Alliance Coordinating Office. On behalf of the Canadian HIV Vaccine Initiative Research and Development Alliance Coordinating Office, I'd like to welcome you to the second part of our two-part webinar on intellectual property. The title of this webinar is Commercializing Your IP, Would've, Could've, Should've. For background, for those audience members who aren't familiar with us here at the CHVI Research and Development Alliance Coordinating Office, or ACO, we were established by the Government of Canada and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in November 2011 at the International Centre for Infectious Diseases, a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization based in Winnipeg. One of the priorities of the Alliance Coordinating Office has been the development of a new and early career investigators program to advance HIV vaccine research and development efforts. With the involvement of our new and early career investigator advisor group that is made up of 14 individuals at various levels in their careers, including trainees, postdocs, research associates to early career faculty members from research institutions across Canada, we have identified priority topics for the training program, and I'm very excited to bring you our 7th webinar in this series. This webinar will be recorded and it will be provided to other members of the CHVA Research and Development Alliance in the training tab within the Alliance virtual community. This webinar on commercializing your IP, would've, could've, should've, will include a presentation that will provide more advanced information about intellectual property and the strategic issues for innovators, universities, research organizations, and small medium enterprises. The presentation will be followed by a discussion period and Q&A. This webinar will be of particular interest to all trainees, postdoctoral and junior faculty level, new and early career investigators, as well as principal investigators with an interest in working on commercializing their innovations. But of course, and as always, all are welcome. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during the Q&A. You can submit your questions using your microphone if you've enabled it. Or you can use the chat box that will be available on the lower right corner of your screen to ask your questions. So just to give everyone who has registered in our online a sense, and just for our purposes, we'd like to ask a preliminary polling question and give you an opportunity to try that out. So just to get a sense of those of you that are online, we are interested in knowing whether you consider yourself an early career investigator. So please go ahead and select yes or no using the buttons now.
No.
Always listen. Yeah, yes. There. Oh, I'll just tell you that.
Okay.
Oh, so that's a no vote. So if you choose not to vote.
Okay, thank you. And Elizabeth, will you pull up the second question? Okay, and the other thing that we're interested in, just in terms of connectivity to the webinar, whether you're using your computer and using the voice over IP, or whether you're dialing in with a telephone. Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers, Eileen McMahon and Cheryl Ryson from Tories. Eileen McMahon is the co-chair of Tories Intellectual Property and Food and Drug Regulatory Practices. Practicing exclusively in these areas, Eileen is one of a handful of Canadian lawyers who advise on intellectual property protection and regulatory clearance for products in Canada. Eileen is recognized as a leading cross-border practitioner in the life sciences sector, particularly medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and foods, in various publications nationally and internationally, including the Chambers Global, Which Lawyer, Yearbook, Lexpert Guide in the Leading 500 Lawyers in Canada, and Best Lawyers in Canada. Further information can be found on Eileen on their website at www.tories.com. Also joining us is Cheryl Ryson, who is the practice leader of the Tories Life Science Group, a cross-border group in both Toronto, New York, and Calgary. Prior to joining Torrey's, Ms. Ryson led the 85-attorney life science group of a U.S. law firm. She has the sole distinction of being ranked in international and national rankings as a leading lawyer in life sciences in both the U.S. and Canada, and has received numerous recognitions and awards, including most recently LMG Life Sciences Finance and Transactional Lawyer of the Year, Canada's Top 25 Women of Influence, and Best Lawyers Toronto Lawyer of the Year. She represents the whole spectrum of life science companies, from startups to large public companies, as well as venture capitalists, investment banks, and academic medical centers, including U.S., Canadian, Israeli, and European entities. She advises companies as to corporate structure and governance, venture capital financing, public offerings, acquisitions, joint ventures, and licensing transactions. Cheryl has worked on the then largest IPO of Canada's life science company and the largest licensing deal of a Canadian life science company. She's a graduate of Barnard College, Columbia University, and the Harvard Law School. Her passion for health sciences endeavors extend to her philanthropic involvements, in which she participates as a founder, director, and/or advisory member for numerous nonprofits, including, among others, the Hospital for Sick Children, Health Technology Exchange, and Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. So thank you very much, and I will turn it over to Eileen and Cheryl.
We are delighted to be here with you today, and thank you for participating. This is Eileen speaking. Cheryl and I welcome questions as we go through our presentation today. So if you have a topic or question that comes to mind, please feel free to pose it in the chat box. We wanted to start off today with a polling question, and we're going to turn to that right after we review here the objectives that we expect that we would cover in the course of today. In terms of the polling question, we'd like to draw on the last session and would like your perspective on what type of IP do you think can be commercialized. So we'll give you a few moments to review the list of IP that we have there. That patents was among the top ranking in terms of what could be commercialized. And certainly in the HIV area, that is a very sound answer. So generally speaking, what Cheryl and I are seeing is that the basis for commercializing IP in this particular space, very strong on the patents front. The second area that is actually very strong in terms of commercializing in this space is actually the last two categories, trade secrets and data. We're seeing that a lot of value is placed in mining data, leveraging data in the course of research and development of products. So the answer is that all of this IP can be commercialized. The particular type of IP that we're seeing strongly in your space would be patents, data, and trade secrets. Cheryl, do you have any comments on that particular result of the poll from our
No, I know it's unusual because, right, I mean, I think the poll results conform to people's general sentiment. What's becoming more and more interesting is data. And data is very valuable to pharmaceutical companies, to clinicians, to government organizations in terms of their planning. And a lot of data is just you're going to make available as researchers as part of your publications and speaking. But you may also want to keep in mind when data might be available for commercialization. And this brings us really to the next slide, is why commercialize? And I want to just talk about this because all of you are researchers for a purpose. You love to do the research. You didn't necessarily decide, I want to go into business. And, and there are views about whether something should be commercialized. So let's say you do have something that can be commercialized. As researchers, why would you want to commercialize? Well, one is we know that funding and grants are really tightening up. So it's public funding I'm talking about. So being able to enter into a commercial relationship sometimes allows for additional funds for your research. The other is it's a way of being able to accelerate your research. When you have more resources behind you, let's say with a biotech company or a drug company, you can actually push your research sometimes forward a little quicker. Also, if you actually want to get something to market and have people use it, you'll need to commercialize it, because that's the only way that patients really can use it on a scale. And other reasons are, of course, it might be able to give you a little financial security, which is not always bad. Many of the researchers that we deal with feel uncomfortable about it, and I've always said, listen, you can always direct any proceeds you have to how you feel it could be best used. Many of the researchers have actually donated their money back to the universities or medical centers that they're at, or their own charities. So again, we're trying to get past the view of commercialization as sort of a is the following. I get a lot of questions from researchers saying, well, I'm really busy doing what I'm doing right now. I don't have time to deal with all this other stuff. So actually, the most common way for a researcher to commercialize is to find someone who will bring it to a business partner, whether it's going to a tech transfer, an internal committee, a lawyer, a friend who's in business, but basically reaching out to other people, because as a practical matter, I'm sure all of you on the phone not only work a full-time job, but probably much more than that. In fact, there are a number of researchers that Eileen and I have worked with who decide they want to commercialize on their own. And our experience is that they try to squeeze in a business on Sunday afternoons. And it never really happens, because really doing it, this is a really hard field, and doing a business is also a full-time job. Sometimes, of course, there are individuals who say, actually, for me, business is exciting. I've done research a long time, but I also like the business aspect. That's usually the minority. But again, there are choices here. And the reason I mention this is that I don't want anyone on the phone to say, you know what, I have no interest in business. I wouldn't mind commercializing this, but I have no interest or time. So if that's the case, there are, you can reach out to others and be pointed in the right direction. And you'll find that there are a lot of business people who are looking for great ideas and research to develop with you. So
we turn to another polling question in terms of your thoughts on the type of IP most commonly commercialized in your field. This is an open question, so feel free to type in responses. Humira adalimumab was the top, if not among the top. And biologics have a huge amount of attention in the field of therapeutics currently. Absolutely right with the other answers. Drugs is the type of IP, the type of product that is the result of commercializing the IP. And the companies and the investors that are behind the IP by way of money, interest, agreements, they typically look to the patents that will shore up the products. So oftentimes if you're at a startup company, for example, or if you're a researcher with the question as to whether you might out-license your IP to a large pharma, or you might put your patents into a company that's a startup, what the investors and the big pharmaceutical and biotech companies look to would be, do your patents cover the product? Do you have a good patent position, even if it's an early stage position? Which is often the struggle in early stage, right, Cheryl? You've got limited financing, and yet you're trying to put patents in place that might intrigue a big player. So we'll now I wanted to pose to you what you would typically look for if you're an industry player or an investor who's meeting, for example, with a researcher, a clinician, a university. And the answer is that they don't simply look to whether you've filed a patent or whether there is a patent that's issued on the product. In other words, the patent application or the patent itself is not what guarantees success. And what investors and industry players really look to is whether there's a connection, some type of nexus between the patent and the end game, which for them is the market, whether it's the public market to raise money or whether it's the market of consumers who are buying drugs or physicians who are prescribing drugs. So Cheryl, do you want to comment on these 4 features that come up time and time again in raising money or doing deals involving researchers and clinicians?
So there are some discoveries that you have that actually are just groundbreaking and could win a Nobel Prize, but they don't have a particular market. No one will pay for it, won't be reimbursed. It doesn't mean that it's not important. In fact, it could be more important. But when you think about whether industry is going to invest money, there needs to be some sort of plan. And so the issue sometimes is that researchers will come and they'll want to patent something. In fact, I am married to a researcher, and despite what I thought was my education to him, he still came to me last week that he wants to patent something. And I said, you know, it doesn't really have commercial value. And he said, you know, I just want a patent. It's very prestigious. And the fact of the matter is, a patent is very expensive. I don't really think it's prestigious. All a patent does is prevent someone else from using your discovery. It doesn't give you anything in and of itself. So when you think, I mean, people think a patent gives you something. It doesn't. It just prevents others from using what you have. And so for an investor, they need to know that they have a special field that will be practical and that can be marketed. In the HIV area, we know that in order for this to be attractive, it has to offer something that the current drugs and remedies do not currently have, and that you have a population that it may suit, and that the agencies, especially in Canada, they'll want to pay for it. In the United States, that you'll get reimbursed for it. So in thinking about patenting and commercializing, you have to think a little differently than you would about if something is a good paper.
So this is Eileen here. I want to show this simply as an example that you can get a patent, as you heard from the last session, on any invention that is new, inventive or non-obvious, and useful. So even here with a U.S. patent on something called a bird diaper, the U.S. Patent Office regarded that test to have been met, that the invention was new, that it was a breakthrough, no one had thought of it before, and that there was some use to it. That said, it's a classic example of the gap between the patent and commercializing the innovation. So there really has to be that nexus to take the IP to the next level in commercializing. How can experts help? Cheryl mentioned that in our work with some leading researchers and clinicians, you're often challenged time-wise. That said, if you have something of value and if you are intrigued by the idea of possibly commercializing your IP, there are lots of persons who used to be in-house, either at biotech companies or pharma companies, who now act as consultants and are mining the field for opportunities. As you may have read, the pipelines of many of the big pharma and big biotechs are dry in terms of therapeutics and diagnostics. And so they're often looking for opportunities. And so there may be ways that you could work with experts to possibly commercialize your IP. Experts can also help in assessing what strategy you use, because we've been involved and have been asked to comment on some horror stories where tens of thousands of dollars are spent, for example, on filing patents and on a patent strategy, yet no one is interested in buying those patents, in licensing those patents, or in financing a company. So the value of an expert can be sometimes saying, this isn't something that we suggest that you go forward with, or you might want to pursue a different direction.
My suggestion would be, let's say you have something and you say, boy, you know what, I probably can't commercialize it. Even if you, researchers will tend to say, you know what, I just want to get this paper out. I just want to get the paper out. But remember, once you publish and it's in the public domain, you may have precluded yourself from getting a patent and therefore precluded yourself from commercializing. So if you think there's a possibility that it may be commercializable, you need to, again, within your organizations, either come to the tech transfer office. If there isn't, call Eileen, for instance, bounce an issue off of someone before you publish, just so you have a sense and make sure you're not foreclosing opportunities.
We're often asked the question about how your IP can be commercialized. One possibility that I often get is, well, is it enough if I simply describe my innovation in a letter to myself and post that to myself through the postal service? Is that enough to protect my IP or commercialize it? Other people will say to Cheryl or me, how about if I raise money? Thank you. So thank you for the responses to the third polling question. The answer is that there are a variety of ways to commercialize IP. Friends and family is often a start, right, Cheryl, in terms of how you might kickstart the commercialization of an invention.
Well, I actually, in this area, would be very cautious. The fact of the matter is these are really high risk. This is high risk, and it takes a long time. And people sometimes don't realize it. A lot of investors get very impatient because they want to know, you buy a piece of real estate, it goes up in 2 years, you sell it, and this might not be an easy path. I think you have to start at the beginning, which is, again, as Eileen said, do we have something that can be commercialized according to, can it be protected? Is there a market for it? Will someone pay for it? Is it better than what's out there already? Once you get that, you need a business plan, and that's where you either have to find some people to partner with you. And again, going to either internal office or external people that can help you. And only then, sometimes the early money does come from friends and family, but I think you have to be very cautious about that.
Mm-hmm. The comment about publishing the invention, it's a possibility, but bear in mind what Cheryl had indicated earlier, and that is if you have filed a patent application before you publish, at least you've protected that innovation, or you have a foot in the door to protect that innovation. If you publish it and then try to seek a patent, you'll have some hurdles with that particular strategy. The answer that relates to describing the invention and mailing it to yourself in the post, it's an answer that is often used, and it harkens back to the time where an invention and a patent used to be granted to a person who was the first to invent in Canada or the United States. That system has now changed, and as a result, mailing your invention to yourself won't do anything in terms of innovation and commercialization. So turning now to our next slide, the options for commercializing IP. Cheryl has touched on a number of these already. For researchers and clinicians, what we see a lot are option agreements, possibly with pharma companies or biotech companies, license agreements, and Cheryl has outlined here the different ways you can slice and dice a license agreement. Cheryl, do you want to speak a little bit about the types of agreements?
Yeah, and collaboration agreements. I mean, the big pharmas nowadays will, if they're interested in a particular field, they'll go in very early. And government agencies will come in early, and you're not limited anymore to just buckets. Are you ready for venture capital? Are you ready for this? There are a lot of possibilities, again, customized to what you have. And I think, again, there might be some special collaborations in your area. The Gates Foundation, which is a sponsor of the Alliance here, they also make selected investments in certain areas of research on a not-for-profit basis, but to get you to a for-profit, into the for-profit sector. But again, don't think, listen, I'm not ready to license it, or I don't want to license it. It could be that you could, as we say, slice and dice it, that you could share the rights to certain territories, to certain fields on a non-exclusive basis. So again, it might sound like, boy, I don't want to deal with all this. I do research. I'm just trying to find a cure for HIV. And that's great, too, because, again, that's why there are other people who are specialized in commercializing. That's why there are lawyers like Eileen who can help guide you along this line.
One comment that we'll make, Cheryl and I are involved in the whole spectrum of innovation. So we'll often be dealing with researchers and clinicians right at the beginning of their invention and helping them to commercialize. But we also deal with companies who are selling big drugs, biologics, chemicals, diagnostics. And I would say that in every example where the biologic or the chemical drug or the diagnostic is on the market, in every example, when I speak with the company that is selling that product and we look at their patents, invariably either a researcher that works out of a research institution or hospital or university is involved. So somewhere along the line there is a patent that company has either bought or in-licensed for that blockbuster. And so clearly there can be value that is actually leveraged for when the product is in the market.
And determining the best option for you, I don't know if it's, you know, I touched on the first one, is if you want to go forward, know yourself. If you know you're busy and you're a researcher, don't try to do this on your own. I don't think you should try to do it in your own. In any event, it's so complicated and no one really does it on their own. But in terms of knowing your competitors, knowing the market, this is an area where I think as a researcher you really could bring a lot of value, which is you need to know what's out there. And I think most of you do. What is out there and what am I trying to do to improve on what's out there? Whenever you approach someone, whether it's an IP lawyer, whether it's someone in tech transfer, whether it's a venture capitalist, whether it's an investor, we're really relying on you initially to give us the information, make life easy. Tell us how this is differentiated. And I think what's really not compelling is when someone says, there is no competition, what I have is better than everyone else, because then there's a lack of, okay, well, if you're not going to tell me, I got to go find out myself. So if you really, in a realistic way, can say, okay, here's what it is, here's the problem I solve, here's who else is doing this in the field, and you can really give whoever you're working with a full story, you're going to speed up the process, you're going to gain a lot of credibility, you're going to not waste your time, and frankly, you're the ones who can best evaluate this because this is your field, this is what you're an expert on.
So in view of that, what are the typical mistakes that will result in an investor saying, I don't want to finance this lab, or I don't want to go ahead with the deal with this researcher or clinician, or for a pharma company to say, I'm going to knock down the compensation I was going to pay to you because I found this wrinkle? Well, the first, and it's very common because, of course, you've got a lot of pressure to publish. It adds to your credibility. It adds to your ability to attract funding for your research. But publishing without having filed patents is a huge issue. And why? Because then you're trying to protect the invention once it's out there, once competitors have learned about it, once the market has learned about it. It's not a complete showstopper, but it definitely will impact your ability to attract interest. The second mistake we often find is a lack of strategy. So a person who is filing patents, multiple patents, without really understanding what the end game is going to be, what the elevator pitch is going to be for an investor, for example. What is the gap that they're seeking to fill, and why will somebody be interested in that? Cheryl, do you want to comment on IP not dovetailing with the business strategy?
Yeah, we find a lot of times, again, it gets back to companies and individuals want patents. We had one client that had 900 patents, and it was a small biotech company. They were spending a fortune on these patents. And, we said, listen, there are a handful of patents here that are very important and on point, and the rest of these are really, they're expensive window dressing. So you want great patents, high-level patents, that cover what you need to for a business purpose. The other thing that I hear a lot about patents is people will say, well, I went to a patent lawyer, I told them what my invention was, and they filed it for me. If that's the kind of advice you're getting, that's not good advice, because you really need a strategy of what are you trying to protect. What do you think you're going to, you want to be able to get as broad a patent as possible that covers your invention, but you don't want to go so broad that you blow it. So, again, in order to make that assessment, you have to do a little business assessment up front and work with your patent attorney to make sure that it's the right patent.
And so that was part of the last bullet, selling the IP story. Cost out of control, that's very common in patent programs, as Cheryl mentioned, where either a startup or a tech transfer office, for example, might be putting a lot of money behind a patent portfolio and the money isn't necessarily well spent. IP not owned, in the last session, the speakers did a great job in taking you through who owns the IP, if you're a researcher or clinician, etc. And that is highly relevant and is something that the investors or companies with whom you might deal would have top of mind. Am I sitting across the boardroom table with the right person? Do they actually own what they say they own? If we could now ask you to respond to this question in terms of the challenges that researchers and clinicians might face in trying to commercialize their IP. Cheryl has touched on a few of the possibilities already. Time being a challenge, right, Cheryl?
I think that's a major challenge.
Money.
Publication, pressure to we're seeing pressure to get publications out. Similarities in existing IP.
Yes. Excellent point that our listeners are making, because the question is, for example, similarities in IP. Many times researchers will say to us, I pulled this patent and I can't believe this other researcher got a patent on this, or I pulled this patent and it's so close to what I'm working on.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, you know, I think the advice we're giving is there are some things that you're going to want to push on to someone else to do who has the expertise. But there are things that maybe you should keep control of and really charge forward. And when we talk about similarities in existing IP, this is where you shouldn't just back off. You should come in and really try to work with your patent advisor on what you think the differences are. Because remember, you know your science better than anyone. Mm-hmm. So just because someone says to you, a patent lawyer says to you, oh, this is very similar, don't just take it at face value. Look at it closely and say, no, it's different in this important way and in this significant way, if that's the case.
And that's an excellent point in terms of similarities in IP. Usually the drug and biotech companies are often so concerned about that similar IP that they end up either buying or in-licensing it from researchers and research institutes, just because they don't want the worry that it's going to come out and bite them down the road.
So what you're saying, Eileen, is if it's similar, actually it could have more commercial value.
Especially if there's a gap, that's for sure. Uh-huh. So now we'll turn to the next slide. Challenges that you can't anticipate. And we hear this a lot. You know, you've mentioned time already, pressures that you're already facing with publication. So you may float the idea whether someone's interested in your innovation, and you get no interest back. The Canadian market for raising money recently, Cheryl, has been quite challenging, right?
Actually, it's much better. As you know, in the U.S. right now, the biotech market is on steroids. I mean, the returns have been exceptional, and frankly, what I'm seeing is, and again, this is down the road, is you can raise money for anything, but that's really not what you're looking for. What you're looking for is a long-term solution, and as we talk about partners, so many of you doing research actually are being courted by the pharmaceutical companies, and they want to engage you. And you, of course, need to be selective. You want to partner with a company. If you do decide you want to partner, you may not want to. You may want to do it, again, with through a company. But if you do, you want a partner that will have a similar approach as you and a mindset, people you trust. Again, no matter how good the documents we write, you need to have trust in the people. And then you also, and we need to think about this more and more, is if you do partner with a pharmaceutical company, these companies change management and personnel a lot, and it's happening more and more. So you need to have confidence in the people that you're dealing with as the pharma, but also some confidence that the pharma itself is invested in your field and that there's some stability there, because unfortunately, these big pharmas used to be very stable. They're quite unstable lately.
So blue sky strategies. In other words, if we could get it right working together as a team, what would we do collectively? Deadlines. So say to yourself, I am going to protect this innovation, and if I don't have a strong U.S. patent on this innovation by January of 2015, that's it. That's my deadline. I'll back away from the project. Instead, people will often continue on, and you get the syndrome of the 900 patent syndrome, because no one wants to put a stop on the project and assess what really is valuable. Have a budget. Control your costs. Cheryl just mentioned the team. The team is so critical. So in addition to brilliant persons who are part of your research and development team, who is your face to the investor? Who is the person making the pitch, convincing people that you have a plan, that there is a real opportunity here? Flexibility. Many times you start down the road and you learn that there's a bump in that path. So your ability to be nimble and jump or parlay into another area is something that we see often with successful companies. Learning from mistakes, Cheryl. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, listen, as they say with entrepreneurship, it's real. And the thing is, researchers are similar. You all know better than we do that's where you learn from, is the mistakes that you make, until you get to a real discovery that you feel comfortable with. So again, these are all growing experiences, and as we say in business, and it's the same in research, if you're not committing mistakes, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough.
So to the next polling question, that is, what do you think the percentages of patents that are commercialized? We have a real range in terms of percentages, from 100% down to 1% and some percentages in between. Thank you. You're absolutely right. It's 1% or less. The gap between the patents and market, as you can see, is 99%. And if that's one takeaway for today, that's the takeaway we would love you to have.
Really? Well, Eileen, that's not really a pep talk for...
It's a good pep talk for having a strategy, because you definitely want to have a strategy behind your plan to commercialization. If we might now turn to our last side, which is the link between IP and why does the link matter. And Cheryl, if you could close with this.
So I think the polling question said it, which is, does this mean that 99% of patents should never have been filed? Or is it because there wasn't a strategy around those patents themselves, and that the patent is just the first step in a process, so that if you don't have a good business plan behind it. So, I mean, Eileen, in your experience, is it just that the patent should never have been filed, or is it a combination of all of these things?
I think it's a combination, because certainly there are many patents beyond 1% that have value, but the challenge is, I think, in setting deadlines and budgets around the patent program. So,
and then in the business area, making sure you have the right team. And remember, this isn't, most of you who are involved in the organizations you're involved in, you're at the top of your field. So we also see people who say, you know, my brother, he's a real estate broker, he's a business guy, I'll have him run my biotech company. Well, that makes no sense, because that's not even his field, and he's not the top biotech entrepreneur. So again, the main thing, I think, in any field is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And when you don't know something, you go out, you find the best people to help you bring it to the next level. And I think that really, the question for you is probably, well, who do I go to? Where do I go to? Again, I don't really know the workings of your internal organization, but I'm sure there are people in tech transfer that can bring you to the next level. You can always feel free to call me and Eileen if you want ideas. And we wish you all luck, and we hope that there will be a number of successful commercial opportunities from those of you on the line. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to open up to questions, and just wanted to come back to our learning objectives. We've got the Q&A, but you'll see the slide, I believe it was slide 2 of our presentation, had a number of learning objectives. And Cheryl and I have tried very hard today to address each of those topics for you. So understanding the IP that can be commercialized, knowing your options, and those range today from selling, out-licensing, starting your own company, partnering, option agreements, for example, with different companies. Best option for you, part of that is knowing yourself, your time, your constraints, what excites you, what would motivate you as part of a commercialization plan. Typical mistakes we spoke about, strategic issues, and blue sky. We have touched on the cost, the challenges, the link between IP and commercialization.
We do have a question. Eileen and Cheryl, if you just want to have a look at the chat box, and I'll just read it for the audio. What would be the best approach for a young researcher for IP application process who works at a university? Who should be the first contact? And this might be valuable for graduate students or postdoctoral fellows.
Well, at the university, there's generally a tech transfer office, and they can be helpful. The tech transfer offices at the university are sometimes very clogged up and bureaucratic. That's what we hear. Therefore, sometimes we'll get calls directly, and there's another question says, what is the cost, which is always scary for graduate students, right? So, when we get calls, we generally have the first call just as a courtesy, and we probably work something out and suggest either work with the tech transfer office. We can give you a little advice on the, behind the scenes, but it depends. The tech transfer, if you think, there's a few questions. Sometimes people will say, I'm scared to go to the tech transfer office because I don't even think they really should own it. I really think it's mine. From my personal, I'm doing research elsewhere, or I started this research at a different university, and so you can't really go to the tech transfer office to ask those questions. Again, you can feel free to call either one of us. We're happy to give you, have the courtesy of a phone call without any charge. But the tech transfer offices are getting quite savvy, and you know, if you get the right people in there, they can be helpful to you. So the other thing is you may want to talk amongst researchers at your institute to say, who at tech transfer did you think was most helpful? Just so that you get paired, you know, you reach out to the right person. As we know, in any institution, there are people who get things done quicker than others. So it's the same within the tech transfer office.
And as Eileen here, thank you for the questions. The one question regarding what does it cost to get advice, when we look at the initial strategy session, so what Cheryl and I try to do right at the beginning with researchers, whether it's on the phone or whether it's a whiteboard session, is, and this is for free because we do it each time we get approached, and that is, what is the end game? Is there an end game here? And then what does it cost to get there? So that the person involved has full information. Then we say to ourselves, if the person is going to try to finance that himself or herself, the researcher says, it's my invention, I dealt with this at a different research institution, I own this, etc., then we try very hard to come up with pricing that works for you. And there are a variety of ways to do that in terms of making sure that you're not bankrupted, for example, by the project. It has to be, you know, people have to work together.
Yeah.
We try to do that very collaboratively.
What we'll find is sometimes your research grants will allow you to put some money towards patents. And number one is we try to scale it. So initially, we'll try to maybe work with you towards a provisional patent application where you can do most of the work and it is not costly, but it gets you in line so that no one can jump before you. Then we scale it up, is we see, is there other interest out there, and then we have like a year to scale up to see, is this worth investing in a regular patent? The other thing is the tech transfer offices will often pay for this. And you can feel free to, if they will either have an attorney for you, but even better if you select the people you want to work with, because sometimes, again, they're rolling out this on a volume basis, whereas if you want to control the quality, you may want to control the people you work with. So again, there are multiple ways, and I think generally we don't see the researchers going out of pocket on this if the university gives them some support or their grant.
I think we have one of the participants who wanted to ask a question using the mic.
Hi there, this is Adam. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, that was an excellent presentation. I just thought it would be easier. I can't type that quickly. So in regards with going to intellectual property office at a university, I have some U.S. colleagues, and they discuss and in discussing IP applications, they seem to have a. This is probably I just would like your comment on this between Canadian and U.S. institutions in terms of the networking capability at finding partners. My conversations with colleagues at U.S. universities say that their IP office is pretty plugged in terms of with a lot of biotech companies, and I don't get that sense here in Canada. Is this something that you've observed? Is it generally better in the U.S., or might it be an impediment for going that route rather than contracting out an independent lawyer like yourself? I wonder if you had any insight into that.
It's an excellent observation. As you can tell by my American accent, I'm American and practice on both sides of the border, and your observation is correct. It's a top universities. If you're comparing the top universities here and the top universities in the States, the MIT, the Harvards, the Stanfords, the California system, University of Texas, they are far ahead of the curve for a variety of reasons, having to do really with the legislation in the states, going back to the Hatch-Waxman Act that was promulgated in the 80s and allowed universities to be able to focus on keeping the IP relating to government grants and being able to commercialize it. So in Canada, we really didn't get into the real game of commercialization until maybe 10 years ago. Some of you who have been around a little longer may even realize that Canadians felt awkward about commercializing as if it was a dirty word. Right now, we're working with the hospitals and the universities to basically ramp up their tech transfer efforts. And I think there's, in general, an openness, right, to doing it. You're going to see a lot of flurry of new leaders in this area that come from industry, but you're right. I think they are not as plugged in as a general matter, but I think you can access those same people again by working with people that you choose and then bringing them into the, you know, what you need to do to get through tech transfer. Again, we find that a lot of times we'll get calls from the universities or the hospitals saying, we have a star researcher here, we really don't want him getting bogged down, can you guys help us? And we will, but we'll go to the tech transfer office and say, we'd like to work with this researcher, can you cover us for that? And generally they're very open to it if they want to keep the researcher happy. So, yeah, I know, because, you know, there's a pecking order. But if they think you have something good, and if you can, and we sometimes have to help make the case, because if you're someone who has a lot of grants, they're going to do whatever it takes to make you happy. If you're a young researcher, sometimes we have to go and say to tech transfer, this is somewhat remarkable, this is really worth your time and your attention, please put them to the head of the bakery line rather than just giving them a number.
Well, that's
your comment is fair, and that's why I think you can't be passive about it. You really have to be proactive.
It sounds as though there's a great degree of salesmanship that researchers have to do in order to get started in that process, and so you basically, the large differences between Canada and the U.S. is a function of maturity of the legislation changes, and that may certainly has hampered Canada in its ability to incorporate new ideas or to file for patents for new ideas. And it's funny, I sent around an email to a lot of the young researchers who are listening to on the call about the timidness of Canadians in terms of commercializing their ideas, and trying to encourage them that it is possible. And the attitude in the U.S. is quite different. A lot of young researchers have a very strong attitude about the excitement of having their ideas commercialized. In Canada, everyone feels as though they're not good enough in order to apply for patents. But I'm glad that you touched on that. That's useful to hear.
I think it's an important observation. And again, I think they're given a little more support. But the atmosphere is changing up here. But I think your point is well taken, which is sometimes you're going to have to push it. And if it's not your personality, find a lawyer, find a partner, find another graduate student who will be able to push it and who has that personality. But, what I laugh, because when I came here, I realized I met some researchers who said, oh, you know what, no one's really interested in my idea. I sent it around to a bunch of VCs in the U.S., and I never got a response. I said, well, what did you do? And the person said, I sent around emails. I said, you can't just send around emails. You really need to make some calls, find out how to get their attention, and so forth, and be a little more proactive. So, I think your point. Thank you.
So what you're saying is that, as is the case of most researchers, and most of them are quite introverted, having that salesmanship may not be, they may not have that type of skill set. So partnering with a lawyer or IP office is probably the best route to go.
Yeah, I think it can be very helpful. Or another researcher who does have that skill set, right? You're going to need a lot of salespeople around you, but I think, can help.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
And one of the other things, it's Tanya, one of the other things that we learned in the first part of the webinar is in terms of ownership of intellectual property and universities is that there are differences among universities, and so it's not all the same, and I just wanted to touch on that just because there are people on the line who are from various institutions, so the advice of checking with other researchers at your institution about their experiences is probably good.
Yes, it's
Any other
here. We had done some work about a year and a half ago because one of our clients wanted to see what the different policies were, and they vary dramatically from university to university, with some giving entire ownership to the researcher and others taking entire ownership by the research institution. So it really does vary. And the other thing that we have found is that even though the institutions have rules regarding ownership, many times it's negotiable.
Yeah, that's true. And it depends. Like, I was involved in a deal right now, and it was not publicly announced, but in the 1990s, there was a doctor that had discovered something, and he went to the university and, said to the tech transfer office, okay, I want to go forward with it. And a lot of times they say, they have the choice. They said to him, we don't think there's anything here. Here, you own it, okay? So, the deal was if they pass on it, and many, you get the ownership rights. They gave the ownership rights to this doctor, and the university kept a very small royalty or percentage of the ownership. Well, this doctor just got a payout. Let's say this, it's going to be close to $100 million. And the university is very excited because they're getting a few $1 million. But if they had pushed this along, they probably would have gotten much more money and much sooner. So, sometimes this guy was very discouraged. He said, I guess it's not very good. So from the 1990s to 2000, didn't do much with it until he talked about it to someone. They said, you know what, this is brilliant. So again, don't get discouraged just because someone doesn't like what you're doing. Sometimes it's a blessing in disguise.
Good point, Eileen. So there's another question. If you just want to have a look at the chat box. The question is, how do you deal with IP when your appointments may be joint between government and university?
Yes, this is Eileen here. So Cheryl and I deal with this question a lot. And the first step is typically to see if you have a contract with the government or the university, because sometimes a contract will bear on ownership. And then if there is no contract, you want to see what the government policy is and what the university policy is. And then the next step is to assess where was the invention developed. And if it happens that it was joint, as the participant has suggested, that perhaps the research happened partly at the government and partly at the university, then, and assuming that both, I mean, the government will definitely consider itself to own the invention if that's part of your job description, et cetera, then you would need to address joint ownership and how do we go forward.
So I'm actually doing this right now with the professor, and there was some questions about where this was actually developed, and basically we got all the parties on the phone, and they agreed to some split. So generally you start with the policies, any agreements you have up front, obviously the policies, and then, you generally can work this out.
And ideally, you want to work it out right at the front, because what we sometimes find is that people will duck and say, well, it's a little complex, I don't want to deal with it now, let me deal with it down the road. And the last thing you want to have happen is that you actually have interest from an investor or a company, and one of their first questions is, show me that you are the right person to deal with, that you actually own what you say you own, or that you have the right to negotiate with us. And if you don't have that tidied up, it's very difficult, and usually the negotiations can go sideways or stop if you don't have that tidied up.
Great, thank you so much. Looks like there might be another one coming in. Again, for anyone who is still on the line while we're waiting for that, reminder of the evaluation. Okay, well, I'm just going to wrap up here. I wanted to thank everyone for your participation in the second of our two-part webinar on intellectual property. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our speakers, Eileen and Cheryl, Eileen McMahon and Cheryl Ryson, sharing your expertise with members of the CHVI Alliance virtual community and our new and early career investigators, as well as our CHVI partner at Industry Canada for their support in helping us to put together this webinar and connecting us to both of you. It's been really great, and I really appreciate that we were able to provide this opportunity to the members of the Alliance. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Hanlis, our instructional design consultant, for her work in facilitating the webinar. The two webinars on intellectual property, what new and early career researchers should know, and this one, Commercializing Your IP, Would Have, Could Have, Should have been recorded, and Elizabeth will, I'm sure, be editing some of the technical difficulties, but will be have been recorded and will be made available in the training tab on the Alliance BC. So should you have had any issues, we'll be posting that on the virtual community. So watch for announcements on the availability on the discussion forum on the Alliance VC. The ACO continues to work on developing new training opportunities with the advice of our new and early career investigator advisory group. So please watch for announcements regarding future webinars that are currently being developed. Some of the topics that the ACO is considering include a webinar on ethical barriers to clinical trial design, the drug development pipeline, regulatory requirements, and clinical trial study design. So again, I'll remind you and invite you to complete the evaluation. And the link is available on your screens. We'll keep that on there for a minute or two. Your feedback is truly appreciated and will help us to enhance and improve on our series of webinars. So Eileen and Cheryl, thank you so much for your generosity and being here to share your expertise with us. It's been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and really, we really admire the work that all of you are doing in the area of HIV. It's really important work, and if there's anything we can do to be helpful, feel free to call us.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everybody.